Hello and welcome back to your Average Joe Sports Network. I'm your host, Drew Hoover. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Let's get right into this segment of draft needs. And today we are talking about the AFC West. And let's just start out with the Kansas City Chiefs. And man, NFL has not looked the same since they drafted Patrick Mahomes, or should I say they traded up to get Patrick Mahomes. And man, you're talking about an MVP season followed by a Super Bowl season and then going back to the Super Bowl. Obviously they lost to the Buccaneers, and the thing about it is that the storyline ended up being, is it going to be like Russell Wilson? Because it was the same story, win a Super Bowl, then lost to Tom Brady the next year. So people are wondering what the future holds for the Kansas City Chiefs. I am optimistic. I think their best days are ahead of them, and I think they still have a chance to build a dynasty now that Tom Brady is in Tampa Bay and the Patriots are now picking up the pieces of their broken marriage. So, they still got a lot of good playmakers, man. They got Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the backfield, Tyreek Hill at wide receiver, Travis Kelce at tight end. They just need to, put that offensive line back together. Injuries is probably the reason why they lost that Super Bowl. People were injured. They had to move players around, and the Buccaneers took advantage of that. And there was only so much that Patrick Mahomes could handle. And so they did sign Joe Thuney, the guard from New England, but they do need a left tackle. Eric Fisher is gone, and so Dylan Landis, offensive tackle from North Dakota State, I feel like is where they're going to go. Man, when you look at his film and you add that with the tape from the Senior Bowl, man, this guy is just dominant, runs through people as an offensive tackle. I think about the Dark Knight movie and Joker referring to the Batman as an immovable object. And in this league, man, if you're familiar with the three coveted positions, usually it goes quarterback, then pass rusher, and then offensive tackle. And so if you want to keep Patrick Mahomes upright and you want to protect him from all these young pass rushers that are coming up every year, then I feel like you need an immovable object. And I think if you draft Dylan Landis and put him on that left side, man, I don't think we're done with the Chiefs quite yet. And so they could draft a defense either in the first round, maybe perhaps in the second round, maybe even third round. And I feel like they can find a starter in those rounds right there, particularly in the edge rusher position. They do have Frank Clark, Chris Jones, but I feel like they could benefit from another pass rusher. And speaking of Frank Clark, there's a young man that's also around his height and size, and his name is Ronnie Perkins, defensive end from Oklahoma. And man, when you watch this man run, he just knows how to bend and get around an offensive tackle. And if you're familiar with Steve Spagnuolo, the defensive coordinator for the Chiefs, he's very fond of players that know how to run stunts. Chris Jones can do it, Frank Clark can do it, and Ronnie Perkins can do it. If you're not familiar with the terminology stunt, it's when the moment that the ball is snapped, all of a sudden the defensive line changes positions. Like if you're a defensive end, when the ball snaps, all of a sudden he's in the B gap or in the A gap, and vice versa. So if you get a guy like Ronnie Perkins that can definitely benefit from that kind of system, then I feel like they could definitely continue to make that defense better, which definitely has improved under Steve Spagnuolo and under the leadership of guys like Tyrann Mathieu. So let's move on and let's go to Las Vegas. And Las Vegas has now a new attraction. It's called the Raiders football team. And they brought John Gruden with them. Derek Carr, even though there's been talks the last few years of he's not great, but he's still good. Maybe they'll draft a quarterback or trade him. Heck, he's still there. They got Josh Jacobs, who's an excellent running back. But perhaps they can use another weapon on there. They got Henry Ruggs. Pretty much the entire starting wide receiving core was rookies. Henry Ruggs, the wide receiver from Alabama. Brian Edwards, the wide receiver from South Carolina. And then Hunter Renfrow from Clemson. But this guy, and I'll tell you why, it's probably most unlikely, but if a guy like this, like the guy I'm going to mention, slides to them, oh my gosh, it could open up so many things. Devonta Smith, wide receiver from Alabama. And again, I'm going to tell you why it's really unlikely that the Raiders could pick him, but he holds the SEC and Alabama career record for receiving touchdowns and receiving yards. And so that means he surpassed Amari Cooper, who's had a career in the NFL with the Raiders and now the Dallas Cowboys. And, he joins Mark Ingram and Derek Carney. I mentioned it when I was mentioning Najee Harris in the last video as the 3 Alabama players to hold the Heisman Trophy. Probably a lot of that had to do with the fact of, like I said, COVID-19 and the fact that Jalen Waddle's absence. But I think, nonetheless, when I look at this guy, what really impressed me, other than his speed and his route running, is the fact that even though he doesn't have the frame, he's not afraid to make contested catches. He's not afraid to make athletic catches. He's not afraid to try to jump over a defensive back and try to fight for that ball. And when you see a guy that, even though his size shouldn't say he can make a catch like that, and it doesn't stop him, I feel like a lot of teams could gravitate towards that. Again, when you talk about a guy with this resume, you don't think he's going to get out of the top 10. But there has been wide receivers like that before. Jerry Jeudy dropped out of the top 10 and ended up in Denver Broncos' lap. But, I think, there has to be a receiver that drops, and maybe it is Devonta Smith, especially when we get to talk about the debate with Jalen Waddle versus Devonta Smith. Like I said, even though he won the Heisman, you have experts like Daniel Jeremiah who will bring up the question, is Jalen Waddle better than Devonta Smith? But we'll get to that in a later time. But let's say they go to the defensive side, It's really been about making that defense better year after year. They're definitely way better off, than when they had only, 10 or 11 sacks a few years ago. They've definitely added on to that. They drafted Khalil Farrell out of Clemson. They have Max Crosby on the other end. So I think the need would be then to draft from the defensive tackle position. And there's a guy that I feel like is very disruptive on the line of scrimmage, and his name is Levi Onwazurski. I may be pronouncing that wrong. The defensive tackle from Washington. And man, when I watch this guy's film, he knows how to get leverage to get underneath an offensive tackle. He knows how to exploit the gaps. And what I love about him the most is his persistence, his pursuit. And if you're a football coach, you always teach your players this: to keep going until the whistle blows. And even the veteran players, they have an act for, when the player goes past the line of scrimmage, to not chase him down and leave it to the linebackers and the defensive backs. But when I watch this guy on film, it doesn't matter if the player's 5-10 yards down the field. He's going to chase that guy down until the ball carrier gets down. And like I said, a guy of this size running that fast, you don't see a lot of guys like that, especially at the defensive interior lineman position. So if you can get a guy like that on your defense, then I feel like you could definitely make a difference, coming forward. So let us go from Las Vegas to Los Angeles and talk about the Chargers, who now have their franchise quarterback. And honestly, man, the Chargers have been so lucky, pretty much since they drafted Drew Brees, even though he didn't end up ending his career. Obviously, he's mostly remembered for his time in New Orleans. They still were smart in picking Drew Brees. And then they have drafting Phillip Rivers. He ended up having a good career with them, even though he had never won a Super Bowl, and even though he had his last year with Indianapolis. And then they end up drafting Justin Herbert, and I feel like, they got a quarterback hopefully for the next 10 years. So, I mean, you got Keenan Allen, you got Mike Williams. They have, they could use a tight end, but I feel like tight ends are more of a round 3, round 4 kind of thing. But I feel like the offensive line is where they can go. When you talk about the defensive pass rushers, especially within the AFC West, Denver has both Von Miller and Bradley Chubb. You talk about the Chiefs, like I said, Steve Agnola with Chris Jones and Frank Clark. And there was a lot of games for the Chargers that could have gone either way. And so I feel like if they get more protection, it could give Justin Herbert more of opportunities to have those games more towards their favor. And so there's an offensive lineman named Rashawn Slater, offensive tackle from Northwestern. And when I think of this young man, I always go back to the film of him against Chase Young in 2019 when Northwestern was playing against Ohio State. Obviously, Ohio State had their way with Northwestern, but nonetheless, Rashawn Slater had his way with Chase Young. And again, when you talk about a defensive end that even before he went to the NFL was considered a future Hall of Famer, and a guy that puts him in his place. And again, I watched a lot of NFL films as a kid, and when I think of that kind of matchup, I think of when it was Michael Strahan, who's a Hall of Fame defensive end, but then every time he had to go to Philadelphia, he had to face John Runyon. And so that's my comparison for Rashawn Slater. I feel like if you put him in there, it gives Justin Herbert a lot of opportunities to make more plays. And like I said, it could be the difference between winning and losing. And we could see the Chargers back in the playoffs in 2021. But let's say they go to the defensive side. Man, they are so good at drafting defensive playmakers. Just Joey Bosa, Derwin James. Last year they drafted Kenneth Murray. I loved that pick so much, the linebacker from Oklahoma. And I think Kenneth Murray could use some help on there. And there's a guy, again, similar to Devonta Smith, where I don't feel like he could slip down to the Chargers. But I feel like, depending on how the draft, unfolds, could end up, being a big pick or a huge steal for the Chargers. And his name is Micah Parsons, linebacker for Penn State. And my instant comparison for him is Ryan Shazier, who used to play for the Steelers, and especially when he came from Ohio State, was known for being used in blitz packages, and that's what Micah Parsons does. They would use him to exploit the gaps, maybe even put him on the outside like you would a safety or a nickel back, and just get after the quarterback. And I feel like with Micah Parsons, like I said, when they lost Melvin Ingram, I feel like you can get an extra guy that can make things interesting in that defensive pass rush while also helping Kenneth Murray help in the middle of the field. And so Micah Parsons, who to a lot of experts is a top 5 player overall and probably the best defensive player in the draft. Again, a lot of people are surprised when players like this drop, but nonetheless it happens all the time. And I feel like if that does happen with Micah Parsons, then I feel like the Chargers could end up being the team to sweep them up. And lastly, but certainly not least, let us go to Denver to talk about the Denver Broncos. And man, I have been really waiting for Vic Fangio's team to take that next step. I loved watching Vic Fangio when he was a defensive coordinator and taking defenses, like San Francisco, like Chicago, and turning them into elite defenses. So far, we haven't seen that yet. They do have Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, like I mentioned before. But I would love to see them build that defense back. And it starts at the back end. The days of Keith Talib and Chris Harris are over. The days of AJ Aboye were short-lived. So to me, I feel like they need to draft a corner. And the number one corner to experts is the guy from Virginia Tech, Caleb Farley. And when I talked about J.C. Horn, it's the same situation where he's a very physical corner. I think he's better at timing, with his hands and breaking up the ball. I feel like he's almost too aggressive, and to me, I almost would prefer Jace Horn over Caleb Farley, just for the fact that, when I mentioned some of the great cornerbacks, I mentioned Keith Talib. In my last video, I mentioned Jalen Ramsey. Those are guys that, yes, are probably the best in their business, but they get very physical and make a lot of mistakes, a lot of penalties, and that's why they move from team to team. You talk about, Keith Talib, from Tampa Bay to Denver to LA with the Rams. And you talk about Jalen Ramsey, who was also with the Rams now. You talk about, I'll mention another name, Marcus Peters, was a great cornerback, a great pick out of Washington. Now, again, he spent some time in LA. Man, a lot of corners end up going to LA. And now he's playing for the Baltimore Ravens. So, not to say that Caleb Farley doesn't have a bright future, but I think Denver Broncos have to be cautious that if they do draft a guy like Caleb Farley, that he may not be there for a long term, maybe 3 to 5 years, and then maybe he ends up being another cornerback that ends up being part of the trade market. So to me, my most comfortable pick is actually one that forces Denver to actually go out of their comfort zone and make a dramatic pick. Now, if you guys follow my Facebook page, I told you I can't post mock drafts all the time because of the length of the videos. But on my Facebook page, if you follow me, I post a lot of mock drafts on there. And my latest mock draft, I had them actually trading up to draft a quarterback. And if you're familiar, they've been really looking for a quarterback since Peyton Manning, going through trial and error. Talking about Brock Osweiler, Case Keenum, now Drew Lock. Drew Lock, we thought last year was going to be his year when they signed Melvin Gordon to complement Philip Lindsay. They drafted Jerry Jeudy to complement Courtland Sutton and Noah Fant, and injuries just plagued the entire team. So you could say, okay, you know what? That was a bad year. We'll take 2021 to really see what Drew Lock is about. But honestly, I don't think they're tied to commit to Drew Lock, considering the fact that they drafted him in the second round. So I don't think there was a lot of high hopes for Drew Lock to begin with. Plus, when you consider the talent in this NFL draft, there's a lot. We're at a point where there's a lot of pro days going along, and so far, all these quarterbacks have had very impressive pro days, which makes teams really wonder how they're going to prioritize and what they're going to do in the NFL draft and free agency. And like I said, you even have to think about the next draft, because even future draft picks have to be involved when it comes to making a play for a quarterback. And so if I'm John Elway, in my mock draft, I had them going to the number 4 pick, so swapping with the Atlanta Falcons. And they used that pick for Trey Lance, quarterback from North Dakota State. I can go on and talk about statistics, because man, they're unreal. But man, I just want to talk about his style of play, because I mentioned John Elway. He kind of reminds me of John Elway. He also reminds me of Steve Young, because a lot of those 80s quarterbacks were quarterbacks that not only can throw darts in the pocket, but also guys that can run like a quarterback. We know about John Elway's helicopter hit in the Super Bowl against the Packers. We know about Steve Young's run against the Minnesota Vikings. So I feel like this guy is a similar type of player, where he's got a strong enough arm. He knows how to maneuver within the pocket, but can also run like a running back. Remember when they're in the day when they're like, "Hey, Steve Young, you want to be a running back?" No, I want to be a quarterback. I feel like the same thing is with Trey Lance. That might be a little bit high regards to some people watching this, but I still believe that he's a difference maker, especially when you consider, like I said, the talent that is there right now. And I feel like they got to take advantage of the talent that they have right now. And you know what? Maybe they'll have to take some needs on defense on the back burner. But if you have a guy like Trey Lance, you got all these young guys now in there. I felt like it's worth it to maybe take a chance on Trey Lance now, and maybe by 2022, like I said, when you've had a chance to maybe have Trey Lance develop, and like I said, now then you can put your defensive pieces around him. Then you can probably talk about 2022 as a chance to really challenge the Chiefs in the AFC West. And this has been another segment of your Average Joe's Sports Network. And I would like to encourage you to like and subscribe, share it with your friends, and have a good one, guys.